There are 2 points I want to mention right at the beginning here. One is that the judge in this case has much more information than the public. This judge is intelligent, compassionate, measured, and has shown he does give matters sober consideration. The second thing is that the judge said there's information pertaining to Paul that should not be made public, and for good reason. Therefore, I won't allow information that was not publicized during the hearing to be made public on this channel. The prosecutor essentially echoed the thoughts and feelings of a lot of people around this. It's not black and white. He said that the assessments included both good and bad, and that who Paul is today is a result of his upbringing. However, the assessments also showed that Paul was predisposed to be abusive even outside of parental influence. Those of you who have followed me for a long time, you may recall I've spoken about tumblers falling into place along with protective factors and other intervening factors. We'll come back to this. The prosecutor said that Paul needs treatment and he needs to be observed on an ongoing basis while incarcerated. Because if he doesn't improve, then there has to be an ability to keep him in custody. I agree. Does anyone think he'll get adequate treatment in jail? The prosecutor used the phrase essentially a sociopath in his remarks. Now, I don't know if that word specifically was used in the assessment or not, but considering the other things that were said, it's my opinion that the prosecutor's remark was not unreasonable. I should tell you, though, I can't diagnose. The prosecution essentially said that he thinks the sentencing should be within guidelines, but for the court to go above or below the guidelines would be understandable. The prosecutor's concern was that there should be something built in so that if Paul doesn't respond to treatment and improve sufficiently, the hands of the authorities should not be tied in respect to the protection of the public. Now, that's not what he said word for word. I'm paraphrasing. That's essentially what he was getting at. I wholeheartedly agree. If people can be treated and rehabilitated, that's great. And we should endeavor to help affect that if we can. But if they don't change, then the fact that they had miserable lives is not reason to put the public at risk. I think I've said this before, but I want to reiterate. Understanding why someone is the way they are, or having compassion for them having been victimized, doesn't mean that you should subject yourself or someone else to maltreatment. And when we're talking about the general public, I think that most people just want to go about their lives. And we all hope that the authorities don't unleash threat upon us because someone felt sorry for a guy. And I'm sorry. I know I sound harsh, but John Q. Public didn't commit these crimes. The defense pointed out the differences between Shanda and Paul to say that the same criteria shouldn't be used to judge both of them. Judges already know that each defendant has to be judged individually. The defense pointed out that no one knows what Shanda did to Timothy when Paul was at work. People know what Paul did because she texted instructions and she didn't have to text herself. We'll never know what other horrors Timothy suffered at Shanda's hands because he can't tell anybody and she's never going to take responsibility. I agree with the defense's statement that we'll never know and that Shanda would have done things independently. What the defense was pushing back on here was labeling Paul as the enforcer. That's all well and fine, but that Shanda was independently horrible doesn't fix what Paul did. And it's just my opinion that her being horrible on her own doesn't mitigate what Paul did. The defense pointed out the difference in Shanda's capacity to understand and Paul's capacity. I get it. His argument is correct, but only as it applies to comparing judgment criteria between these two defendants. And I think it's a bit of a misdirect. The judge knows how to apply the law. The judge knows to judge this defendant based on what this defendant did and what he learned about this defendant. The defense pointed out the differences in role between that of mother and that of sibling. I get what he was going for here, but it falls short and I'm not buying it. He didn't elaborate or distinguish points of argument on this, and just leaving it as it was made my stomach turn a little. He pointed out that Shanda was the leader and Paul was the follower. Really, I think it goes much deeper than that, but he didn't make his argument substantive, in my opinion. He said that Paul showed remorse. Let's talk about that briefly. It's my opinion that Paul showed moments of remorse, but they seemed fleeting. It seemed he didn't fully grasp all of it. And I wondered at the time if all this was a function of how long it's going to take for him to fully process the whole picture and his role in it, or if it was a sign of something else. Sometimes people can show what appears to be remorse, but it's sentimentality, and that's different. And some people learn what it is that they're supposed to say and how they're supposed to act, and that's not remorse. And some people are sorry they got caught, not sorry they did the thing. If we ever really know the depth and the extent of Paul's remorse or lack of it, I don't think that's going to show up for a while. The defense pointed out that Paul was truthful even when it didn't benefit him. The defense said that when Timothy was 18 months old, he was being underfed even then, and it was bad enough to cause failure to thrive. So Shanda was doing this to him from the time he was an infant. And at this time, Paul was only 7 years old. Obviously, he had nothing to do with that. This is a pattern in the home, a pattern of abuse and neglect inflicted by Shanda. Paul would have no frame of reference for what normal is. The defense pointed out that the children in the household, including Paul, had been trained to secrecy, had been trained not to tell anybody what was going on at home. This would have become the pattern. And essentially someone growing up in this wouldn't even think to talk to someone, especially when they had no meaningful outside relationships. The key word here is meaningful. Merely having outside contact is not enough. The professionals assessing Paul mentioned more than once that he'd normalized the abnormal, which is common when a child grows up in an environment like this. The traits that Paul exhibits that look like they may be due to autism are not due to autism. They are due to the abuse and neglect that he suffered. I once worked with a man who had been duly diagnosed and institutionalized for that reason, but a later assessment showed he had no intellectual disability at all. What everybody thought was an intellectual disability was all a result of the environment he'd been subjected to. I worked with a woman who was a crime victim and who nobody believed because sometimes she was incoherent. She said conflicting things. Her behaviors were bizarre. I'm talking way out there bizarre. Within 1 month of being free from her abuser, her behavior was completely different. What I'm saying is that this is a thing. Trauma can do a lot to a person, especially if that person didn't have a foundation to begin with or had other vulnerabilities to begin with. Does that mean Paul should get a pass? Well, there are other factors that say no, he shouldn't, and we'll get to those. But even if there weren't other factors, we still have to make sure he can't hurt anyone else. The assessments showed Paul was capable of recognizing that what was happening to Timothy was abusive, and what he was doing was abusive. Paul wasn't afraid of Shanda in the sense that he feared violence, but he had no other place to go. I suggest that he wanted her love as well. We all want our moms to love us. And if you don't know the pain of not having your mother's love, be glad. A couple of other things came out that are significant. One is that Paul enjoyed having power and control. I've indicated this before, but I'll say it again. That's a huge danger sign. Unchecked, that would have escalated and there would be other victims. This isn't going to just go away on its own, and it indicates the presence of substantial risk to members of the public. There was mention of history of cruelty to animals. This is another big one. Studies have shown that people who will be cruel to an animal will be cruel to a person. If you look into the histories of extremely violent criminals, you'll find cruelty to animals. You'll find that these people actually enjoy the cruelty. Many years ago, I attended a conference put on by the United States Humane Society. They came up here to Canada to do in-service training for police. They were showing us all the studies on these connections, and they wanted to encourage cross-reporting between agencies. And sometimes this is difficult because of laws around confidentiality. They wanted law enforcement and animal protection to cross-report wherever possible, because what they found was if you see violence between people in a home and there are animals in that home, the chances are very high that that animal is suffering cruelty as well. And if you see cruelty to a pet in the home, chances are high that there's cruelty to the people within the home. One of the other significant things that came out of the assessment was that contextual factors were not a necessary condition for Paul's behavior toward Timothy. And this is huge. They're saying he has a predisposition. Remember I talked about tumblers? If you've got someone with a predisposition, there aren't that many tumblers that need to fall into place for that person to cause harm. And there have to be protective factors put into place. There was never any intervention for Paul, and there was a lot to train him and even propel him into causing harm. Anyway, that there's cruelty to animals in Paul's history is important. Add to that the lack of a solid foundation, the lack of proper socialization, the lack of a normal frame of reference, a pattern of behavior of bullying on his part, actually enjoying exerting power and control, and remorse that seems to be transient, lack of intervention, the training and modeling for manipulation, and that there's an existing predisposition and that he still has not fully accepted his responsibility, and the utter lack of protective factors. It doesn't take a rocket scientist or a threat assessment specialist to recognize he poses a threat to the community. I said it in my last video, and what we heard today confirms it. We witnessed the making of a monster. Simply giving him a pass is not going to help him, and it certainly won't reduce the risk to the public. In sentencing, the judge said the court is worried Paul won't get the help he needs in prison, but the court can't just let him go. I agree. There was only one thing that I slightly disagreed with the judge on, and it was just a word. It was wording. And maybe it seems inconsequential to anyone else, and maybe it only matters to me because of my work. He said that the stepfather leaving the home was the trigger. I say the stepfather leaving the home was the removal of a protective factor. The judge said that once the stepfather was gone, there was no one to hold Paul and Shanda back. I said exactly this previously. The reason I'm picky about the word is because the words trigger and removal of a protective factor are different things and they carry different connotations. If you and I are walking down the street and somebody attacks you, that will trigger me to intervene. And if I have to use physical force, well, then I will. But without that trigger, it would never enter my mind to physically go after somebody. Offenders like Paul and Shanda and others do think about hurting someone else, but there are things stopping them. Protective factors. Imagine someone thinking about robbing a gas station, but he doesn't do it because there's a uniformed police officer sitting there. But when that police officer leaves, guess what? That gas station's getting robbed. The police officer leaving was not the trigger. It was the removal of a protective factor. The judge said that in spite of the environment, court can't ignore Paul's decisions and behaviors. He pointed to Paul shifting blame, and he said he thought Paul was manipulative. And for those who want to be hard on the judge on that, remember two things. One, he read much more information than what we all have. And two, he's been around the block a couple of times. He's used to people coming into court and saying, "Oh, I've turned over a new leaf. I'm better now." Whatever they need to say to get what they want. The judge said that Paul is just as bad as Shanda. He sentenced him to 30 to 100 years. And Paul looked shocked.
Based on all that, it's a sentence of the court. You serve 30 years to 100 years, Michigan Department of Corrections. Credit for 592 days you've already served. Court's going to assess a $68 state cost, $130 crime-based assessment.
To everyone out there who steps in to help the vulnerable, to everyone who refuses to look away when a child or an animal is being hurt, keep caring, keep speaking up. It might not seem like it matters, but it does. You may never know what the positive seed you planted grows into. You may never know what you prevented, and that one soul who you help, just one, that one is worth it. Trust your gut. I'll see you in the comments.